Good morning, everybody. Today, we're very happy to have Justin Wallin with us. He's one of the top pollsters here in the U.S., and so we're very excited to get some of his insights on the current election coming up that we're all watching, and maybe learn a little bit more about what polling is and isn't. We're going to give folks maybe another minute to show up to the room. I'll let Weston give a more of an introduction to Justin, but just in case you haven't been to one of these before, which I think we've all gotten used to them by now, you can enter your questions at any time via the chat bar. We'll have a Q&A session for the second half of the presentation. Go ahead and submit any questions you have. We'll be sure to bring them up. If you're just listening in by phone, you can always email me your questions, eric@harbortrucker.com. And as with all our HTA events, this is for educational purposes only. You cannot repurpose or redistribute the presentation in any way. And I'll let Weston take it from here.
Thanks, Eric. We're so lucky today to have Justin Wallin with us. Justin is one of the premier pollsters in the United States. He has been the right-hand information man in many cases for high elected officials in the Republican Party. He's been one of the main issues pollsters in California, working with all kinds of municipal districts and corporations. Justin's been a great friend of mine and somebody I've gotten the honor and pleasure to work with many times, and he's been a great barometer for what's going on in DC and what's going on throughout the country that will impact DC at election time, and I'm very lucky to be able to tap into him as a resource. And for that, we wanted to bring Justin to you today. He was one of the most accurate pollsters in 2016 predicting the presidential election. As we know, many were very wrong on that election prediction, but Justin got it right, and we're happy to have him here today. Justin, how you doing, my friend?
Fantastic. It's good to see you, Weston. Always good to see you.
Justin, I'm going to let you give us a little bit of an overview of what's going on. We've got I hear we've got a little bit of a hot election coming up in November. There's some big things. I think there's some gasoline thrown on the fire this week, obviously, with now pending Supreme Court justice appointees. But I know you've got some great information for us. If you could tell us what's going on, what we need to be aware of. I'm going to hop off and I'll hop back on when we get into the interactive portion. But thanks for being with us.
Sounds fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'm going to just kind of chat for a little bit. I actually, unusually for me, I prepared some remarks because there's just so much going on and there's a couple of interesting figures. So about 20 minutes of me kind of chatting about what's going on politically and kind of what how this may or may not impact trade and ports and that sort of thing. And then I think we'll be doing a little bit of chatting. But Weston, as my friend, can always heave a verbal brick my way with a question or any kind of redirection. And at the end of it, we'll have plenty of time, I think, for questions and answers and kind of digging into some of the fun stuff. So first and foremost, I mean, if you do make the mistake of turning on the news, you would quickly come to one conclusion, and that is that Trump's done. There's absolutely no way he can win re-election. Over the past several weeks, we've seen headlines about the president allegedly disparaging war heroes. We see reports of COVID-19 continuing to plague our country with apparently no end in sight. And even the latest campaign news is bad. Our billionaire president is in a significant campaign cash disadvantage to former Vice President Joe Biden. According to the AP, quote, the Trump campaign had pulled most TV ads over the previous week, this is actually the beginning of September, ceding the airwaves to Biden, who was outspending Trump by more than 10 to 1. And Axios reports that, quote, Biden and the DNC raised a stunning $365 million in August, breaking the record for 1 month of presidential fundraising. And as of now, 538, which is considered one of the preeminent election data forecasting outlets, predicts Biden with a 78% chance of winning the election. 78%. If you had those odds in Vegas, stick a fork in the president, he's done. But if we look back in history, almost exactly 4 years ago, I know 4 years ago is ancient history, but almost exactly about a week ago, Hillary Clinton had a 70% win probability. Trump's odds on September 9th were just 30%. His odds today, according to 538, 22%. And at 30%, by the way, that wasn't even Trump's most dire moment back in 2016. Clinton's odds soared in the final weeks of the campaign. On October 17th, just before the third presidential debate, Hillary had an 88% chance of winning, according to 538. So the exact probability that 538 predicts for Biden now is where Hillary was at her zenith. On election day, Trump, based on all the polling averages, all the data, all the early voting numbers, were given just a 28% chance of winning. Better odds than he has now. Obviously, I share this to put a few things in perspective. We're experiencing a bit of deja vu all over again, with Trump once again doing better than the media claims or the poll projects. At least that's what I believe. I'm reminded of a quote from the transcendentalist philosopher Henry David Thoreau, who once wrote, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." The media looks at national polls and see, and by the way, I'm not against the media. They're kind enough to put my ugly mug on their screens fairly regularly, and I appreciate it, but they misinterpret numbers a lot. They look at national polls and they see Joe Biden with an insurmountable lead in the national popular vote. Real Clear Politics, which publishes a running average based on the national polls, shows Biden with anywhere between a solid 7 and 8 or 9% lead. In some cases, there's a 10% lead a couple of weeks ago. So it's hard not to see those numbers if you are on the Biden camp and not be overconfident. But what most people aren't seeing is how close the race really is. If you dive into the Electoral College, things get much closer. Trump can lose 36 electoral votes and retain the presidency. So what does that mean? He can give up Arizona and Pennsylvania and still win. He can lose Pennsylvania and Michigan if he holds Arizona. And there's even the possibility that if Trump drops Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, there'll be a tie. So the presidential election will ultimately come down to half a dozen states. California doesn't matter. Sorry, I'm a California boy myself. Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Ohio are the states. So let's run through those states based on RCP's latest polling averages. And actually, this is about a week ago I pulled these. They're a little bit broader right now. Arizona, Biden's at about plus 5%. I think as of this morning it was about plus 6%. But give or take a percent, we're in there. Wisconsin, Biden 4.4%. Pennsylvania, Biden's up plus 4.2%. Michigan plus 2.6%. Ohio 2.3%. Florida 1.8%. And by and large, Trump is down about 2.5% in his must-win states. And yeah, I get it. Things move around. There's a poll this morning that shows Pennsylvania tied. There's movement. There's always movement. But a running average of polls is a decent bellwether. Trump's moving in the right direction in these battleground states. Biden now holds just about a 4% edge in swing states, and Biden's going the wrong way, having peaked in July at about 6% spread. Trump would have lost if the election was held in July. He did several things that were very poorly received. They had nothing to do with coronavirus, by the way. There's all sorts of things we can talk about with that, but they had to do with his reaction to George Floyd-related events, and he made a significant proportion of Americans very uncomfortable. But that world has changed. Americans' memories are very, very short, and the election cycle is very compressed. So the world is different now, and Trump is doing better than we realize. In some ways, he's doing better than the polls show, by the way. There's a couple reasons for this. One, it's become socially unacceptable to be a supporter of the president. You cannot normally be a college-educated professional and express your support for Trump. Doesn't go well over on Facebook, college reunions, or dinner parties, generally. And among many moderate Republicans, there's an element of hold your nose and vote for the president's qualified support. I don't like his tone, but that sort of thing. But it doesn't take much. If just 1 or 2% of Republicans and independent voters refuse to share their support for the president publicly or in a poll, that's the difference between victory and defeat. And second, polling relies on turnout projections and demographic modeling and weighting. Turnout is, of course, subject to change right up to election day. This year, especially as more states shift to mail-in voting, adopt other measures to accommodate for COVID-19, there will be an effect on turnout. No matter what, turnout will be larger than ever before. It will be massive. But it's important to note that it's massive across the board, not just more Democrats, not just more independents, not just particular demographic. All will increase, but not at the same rates. And in this regard, Trump is underrated. His base is older. It's a more reliable voting group. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote, even more so during this election. Younger voters aren't nearly as reliable, and while they may show up in greater proportions this year, I don't believe they'll show up in the proportions that are being projected. So if a poll gets the weighting wrong and overestimates youth turnout, it could be a huge difference in the race. Again, we're not talking about a big margin of error. In battleground states, the gap is just 3 or 4%, which is well within the margin of error. So even slight misses on weighting and demographic projections will skew the survey. So margin of error, when you're looking at that stuff, if someone's up 3 points or 4 points, or depending on the poll, maybe even as much as 6 points, the response isn't this person's up by a slight amount. The response is, the interpretation, the correct reading is, it's tied, it's too close to tell. And that's one of the things that media makes a mistake with, because you get headlines by saying someone's leading or someone's losing. But in many cases, the actual news is there is no leader or loser that is clear at that point. And we miss that a lot in today's noise. But finally, in terms of Trump's potential advantage now, the emphasis on anti-police brutality protests may well bolster Trump's support down the stretch. He kind of offers this tough guy, dirty Harry thing. But in swing states, that's going to perform better if voters become fearful for their children and families. Americans do want to see reforms to the justice system, and that's where Trump misplayed his hand in July. But the images of lawlessness and riots and protests will drive voters to Trump. So my favorite bellwether for these sorts of things is Michael Moore, and even liberal filmmaker Michael Moore's alert to the potential of Trump's reelection. Quote, sorry to have to provide the reality check again, Moore wrote in a Facebook post. Quote, are you ready for Trump victory? Are you mentally prepared to be outsmarted by Trump again? This is at the very tail end of August. So I know that for resistance and certain progressive folks, and today I'm in DC, which is very progressive, the prospect of Trump's reelection, it is likely to cause a mental breakdown. But in the real world, those of us who are fortunate enough to still be working for a living and are affected by trade, what difference does the presidential election make for our economy, for the trade war, and our pocketbooks? It means a lot. Coronavirus gets all the attention, but our economy was arguably battered more by Trump's trade war with China than it has been by the coronavirus. Last November, a study commissioned by the Port of LA found that Trump's tariffs threatened nearly 1.5 million US jobs and more than $186 billion of economic activity nationwide. California alone has seen massive export declines to China in certain sectors. Soybeans down 96.9%, grains down 85.5%, glass down 86.5%, and rubber down 74.9%. Before coronavirus, Port of Los Angeles saw a 19.1% decrease in cargo movement for October in 2019. Compare that to 2018, when LA and Long Beach were breaking records for cargo through our ports. The initial devastation from the trade war was far more substantial than the ongoing effects of coronavirus. For the Port of LA, this past July was the 7th best month in the history of the port, and the second best July performance for the port, only topped by a stronger July 2019. The Port of Long Beach reported the total trade increased by more than 21% in 2020, July 2020 versus the year prior. So that question of when will we find a COVID-19 vaccine? For the ports, that question, I think, should come secondary to how will we resolve the trade war with China. If Trump wins re-election, we'll quickly find out whether the trade war with China was an empty campaign tactic to pick up key swing states in the Midwest, or whether he really is ideologically committed to holding a tough line against China on trade. On the other economic questions, Trump and Biden really offer very few differences. The race for a COVID-19 treatment or vaccine, that's being decided by pharmaceutical researchers and scientists. And both Trump and Biden seem intent on opening the floodgates of economic stimulus, with small differences at the margin. And of course, the Federal Reserve operates independent of the White House and will continue to pump money into our economy regardless of who's president. But Joe Biden poses his own unique threats to our economy. After the trade war, the biggest threat to our local economy comes from the burdensome regulations coming out of Sacramento. And we know that our ports are losing market share because of the high cost of regulations. We're effectively chasing freight away from California with extensive regulations that seek to punish cargo for emissions. Environmental regulations in California really are killing our port competitiveness. our ports in California are at a competitive disadvantage. The updated Clean Air Action Plan of 2006 and its goals for zero emission cargo handling equipment by 2030 and zero emission trucks by 2035 has added $14 billion in cost. And since 2006, our ports and cargo industry have spent billions of dollars in environmental programs to reduce emissions and become compliant. And our ports are now the cleanest in the country. But instead of being grateful for these anti-pollution measures, Sacramento has piled on more regulations. Just several weeks ago, the Air Resources Board adopted new regulations that are estimated to add $7 billion in cost to ship cargo. The new engine emissions restrictions will cost an estimated $4.5 billion, while the requirements on our ships will cost $2.23 billion. In picking Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, Joe Biden sent a clear message that Californians will have tremendous sway in his administration. And make no mistake, federal regulatory decisions come down to presidential appointments. Mary Nichols, the chair of the California Air Resources Board, could be your next EPA administrator. Across hundreds of other positions in transportation, environment, and commerce, you'll see California's top regulators move to Washington. You can call it the Californication of trade and environmental policy. So you can pretty much pick your poison. Trump could continue his devastating trade war with China, or Biden leaves us susceptible to death by 1,000 regulations. Last fall, John McLaurin, the president of the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, urged California to engage in a calm, rational, and honest discussion about trade, the economy, and new restrictions from Sacramento. That discussion starts with properly educating Californians and the rest of the country about how things really work. How do Californians feel about our ports and goods movement? Most are simply uninformed. They don't know. They don't have an opinion. They don't realize the sheer scale and volume of movement of goods through our ports. I didn't, and I'm fairly aware of policy issues, but the scale, always surprising. I didn't realize that our LA Long Beach complex remains North America's largest, shame on me. And the study looking at the impact on our local ports was clearly eye-opening. You know, $380 billion in annual cargo value, more than 3 million jobs, and impact on 50 states. The awareness of the impact and positive interaction with our economy is something that Californians and Americans don't really understand to the degree that they're going to need to over the next decade and more. So before we kind of get into some question and answer, and happy to get into some decoding polling and this sort of thing, I think Wes and I can banter back and forth and answer any questions you have. I would just like to underline the importance of communicating this value of your vested interests. That communication needs to be, and I know it's effectively taken care of within the halls of government, but it also needs to be taken even more increasingly year upon year to the broader public. Public needs to know. Fundamental message doesn't change regardless of whether we're talking Trump's trade war or Biden's environmental restrictions. People need to know. Weston, love to chat a little bit if want to do some questions and answers.
Absolutely. So that's a great overview, and I think you summarized it great with the death by 1,000 cuts remark. That's how we feel every single day. Our members invest. Our members do everything they can to try to not just move America's cargo, but do so in a responsible and sustainable way. Yet it seems like the state government, the regulators are thankless in the efforts of our members. And one of the things I keep bringing up, which I'll lead into this question, is, you know, it's one thing to regulate the truckers here locally, and it may improve local air quality, but if the freight moves elsewhere, it does not actually help our climate change goals. It does not help the efforts to reduce the overall carbon footprint. And since the current measures by CARB, by the ports, by AQMD, in a broad sense, are really geared more at the climate change toxins like nitrous oxides and greenhouse gases, it seems a little bit foolhardy to implement regulations that may make cargo move elsewhere, jobs move elsewhere, and air quality as a whole get worse. And so my question is, should Joe Biden win the presidential election and California have that level of influence? You brought up a name that we all know very well, Mary Nichols. So Mary Nichols' EPA, I think, would be much different than the current administration's EPA. Do you think that it gives California more power to continue to act unilaterally in the silo under the Clean Air Act, or do you think it starts to create more of nationalized policies that we've already seen at CARB?
Yeah, I think it creates more nationalized policies. The scary thing is that California's always they've got this feeling that they always have to be beyond. So what'll happen is American ports will become less competitive, and our ability to move and be effective as transporters will be affected dramatically. And the costs will all be shifted onto consumers and, of course, onto the industry itself. But while that goes on, we start thinking, well, at least the playing ground. I mean, the positivist, the hopeful thinker will think at least the playing ground will be normalized, and California will be on equal footing with our costs versus the rest of American ports. And that's just not the case. What will happen is, and we've seen this time and time again, America follows California regulations, and then California regulations go that extra mile and become more and more burdensome, and they're 30%, 40%, 50% more stringent and challenging than elsewhere. And there's been no ramifications for that, right? I mean, the ports haven't closed, which is ultimately the determinator of whether something continues or not. You know, those regulations and taxes and burdens and whatever they may be, they continue until the camel dies.
Yeah, and so these are obviously some of the things we're looking at, broad picture, right? I mean, I think from our members' perspective, things like the EPA holding carbon check has been a great way for us to actually continue. We've said, how do we get to zero emissions? How do we get to sustainability, both from an economic and an environmental standpoint? And I think the federal government has said, yeah, how? Show us the how. So that kind of moves on, right, into the next one. We may get into this into some of the decoding polling, but you know, for us, we have some very, very good friends in the Senate, especially on the Republican side. Obviously, they've been in leadership. We work very closely with Senate Commerce, EPW, you know, more and more with agriculture, being that California's a big agricultural exporter. And so I look at it, and we talked a little bit beforehand. You know, I think there's three scenarios that we'll see. Trump gets reelected. Well, four scenarios. Trump gets reelected. Republicans hold the Senate. Democrats still hold on to the House. I don't think the Democrats lose the House. I think we can agree on that, right? Biden wins. Republicans hold the Senate. Democrats hold the House. Biden wins. Democrats win. Democrats hold the House. We're looking at a few different scenarios. What, from a trending perspective, do you think is most likely? Because you know, we deal with the supermajority here in California. It hasn't turned out too great for business in general. Where will the checks and the balances be?
It's a fantastic question. It sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. Numerically, I can't really give a good perspective of Senate up until a couple of weeks ahead of time. So right now, it's just there's too many moving parts. And once we introduce the justice issue, that changes a lot of things in different states. So it's just very, very challenging. Now, the presidentially, as I mentioned, things have changed a lot since July. Right now, even though the polls show Biden up, I think strength lies with Trump because the enthusiasm for Trump is higher. The question is going to be, what do we see over the next couple of weeks? And either side will argue that this open seat, this open judicial seat, will galvanize their voters more than the other. We just don't know until we start actually seeing those numbers. So right now, my only thing on the presidency is it isn't in the bag for Biden. It's actually very, very close, too close to call. If I had to bet, someone put a bat to my head and said you must, I'd say that I think that gravity favors Trump, even though very, very narrowly. But in terms of the Senate and which way that'll flip, it's just too tough for me to tell right now. I think stasis is, 2 days ago, I would have said stasis. It would have changed, pretty much stayed the same. But right now, it's just very, very difficult to tell.
So you brought up a really important thing, which is, whose side will galvanize and the passion behind their base, right? I think it's very obvious in many places where you see the passion for the passionate Trump supporter. There's a lot there. I think in certain pockets of the country, like Southern California, LA, Long Beach, the Bay Area, you see a lot of support for Biden, Harris, and it's very passionate, but maybe you don't see that in some other areas of the country. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask about is given COVID, right, and given the way that this election may be different, how do things like vote by mail come into play where they didn't in the past? How do we take early reporting, as we may have a stronger vote by mail absentee ballot process than in the past? I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, you couldn't use an absentee ballot unless you were really absent. You were unable to physically working the polls, for instance, for a candidate was not an excuse not to go to the polls. But here in California, it's a very regular thing. I'm a permanent absentee vote by mail. I know a lot of people are. So how do you look at that and how it may impact the election? What's the COVID effect going to be?
Sure. There's two things. One is I expect what we've typically seen in California with absentee balloting this trend to continue. And the trend is that Republicans vote earliest, and those are the ballots we see early on. So Republicans tend to have a stronger lead in tight races, and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter as ballots are counted, and tends to go more towards Democratic candidates. I don't see any reason why that would change. The big question is, now that we have with such extraordinarily wide and broad voter registration, it's almost universal, and now we have universal mail balloting, how many people actually participate? So what we're doing in polling, we normally do likely turnout models that are based on historical data and are remarkably accurate, because we have this extraordinary data vault of how California voters, and just focusing on California, how California voters vote, when they voted. We know who they are, and we know, their gender and age and ethnicity and party and all this sort of thing. That gives us amazing ability to forecast what their behavior will be in the future. The problem is now we have this massive set of unknowns, all of these new registrants. How do we account for that? So what we do is we have to model everybody and then model back to what we think based on behavior it's going to look like. And it turns out that it's actually not a huge delta. In elections, it makes all the difference in the world. But I mean, in many cases, we're forecasting an 80% voter turnout. Just on the natural, based on behavior, which is unbelievable. 80%. I mean, that's like an Iraqi dictator turnout, right? Where you get a gun to your head. Yeah, yes, you voted, and everyone voted for me. This is actually real world stuff. For once in America, people give a rip about politics, more so than they did in 2016, more so than ever. And I think that's going to become more compressed as the pain of COVID starts to be felt more and more. And one thing on that note is the COVID effect is one, that function of balloting. And then the other part is how people feel pain over time, because pain is what galvanizes elections. Hope, yes, in a perfect place, in a good world, hope and these sorts of things galvanize, but more often than not, pain galvanizes elections. We've seen an extraordinary amount of pain. One that's focused on a lot is the health and safety and well-being. Am I going to get sick? My loved one's going to get sick. We're going to get better. And the other component of it, which is starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and in many cases, it's eclipsing that health and safety component, is, do I keep my job? Do I get my job back? What do I do in 2 months? Am I losing my house? Am I losing my car? Massive amounts of pain. And that pain is being felt and seen by people who aren't necessarily feeling it themselves. Those stores that are boarded up, maybe you're in an urban environment and they got boarded up because there was some civil unrest. The boards aren't coming down in many cases, and it's very visible, and that instills fear. And I think that effect is something that we have yet to really see. Will that galvanize new voters?
Yeah, so you brought up something that I think is fascinating, which is you go to neighborhoods where things are boarded up, whether it's because business owners can't make muster or you had civil unrest, but in a lot of cases, those are locally controlled by Democratic leadership, and they're in blue stalwart areas. And in some of those cases, Trump administration's been vocally critical of the leadership in those local areas and has basically said, hey, this isn't on me. Open up your economy, get these people back to work. It's your local mayor, it's your local county supervisor. It's these guys that are holding you back. And how is that message playing with voters? Because, I think in many cases, all politics is local. And it's funny because sometimes people vote for president thinking it's going to help their school taxes or something, like not understanding what the purview of
how they vote for city council, right? It has no purview.
Yeah. But it's interesting because the juxtaposition is the way I'm looking at it. And again, I'm not looking at the data you are, but in red states, he's pretty popular. And it seems like there's a certain sense of, yeah, my local government's letting me act a certain way. And in some of the struggle areas, it's more it's more the data COVID driven. We need to be careful. I mean, my home state of Pennsylvania has been very slow to reopen. California, we have some of the most stringent regulations still, and we've been hit very hard by some of the civil unrest. You look at some of the swing states, Wisconsin, right? You've got an interesting dynamic there. So how does that local versus federal play out?
Yeah, I think that's an increasing, it's the $1 million question. And the question is whether they're blaming Congress or blaming the president, because they're two distinct perspectives. And I think that the pain locally of not being able to make a living and take care of yourself and your family, that will end up being ascribed to people who say we need to continue to be closed down. And I'm not making a judgment call on it one way or another, but I think you'll see this in a lot of places that are very typically very strongly blue, whether it's New York City. Yeah, New York City. I mean, when they're saying that 50 to 60 or more % of restaurants are going to shut down, New York City runs on restaurants. Give me a break. I mean, the amount of pain that causes is unbelievable. And all the subsidiary businesses that thrive on the foot traffic of people coming in and out, those people will feel betrayed. Because at the end of the day, they lost their business and no one paid them. The government said, stop working, but they didn't care for them. That's betrayal. That feeds into fairness. And that is a powerful, powerful thing. Doesn't necessarily mean that they become flag-waving Republicans. What it means is there's a loss of faith in whoever they ascribe that judgment to. And I think in many cases, there's a direct line between local regulations and congressional, especially at the House, direction, which basically says we stay closed until there is a clear and safe path. Unfortunately, people are feeling very unsafe, and they've been feeling very unsafe for 3 months, and it'll get even worse. I think that's the real danger. By the way, I don't know if it's actually going to change Democrats or true progressives. That's not what I'm saying. You may lose a few points here and there, but independents. Yeah, independents, this group of people who really do surge back and forth and has been growing. I mean, California, the registration space of NPP has just been exploding. Those people are who we have to watch for. And I think at the end of the day, we'll see a lot of people who are quote unquote willing to hold their nose and vote for Trump more than we anticipate.
Yeah, I've got two other quick questions. I just want to remind folks, we're doing some open Q&A. We're going to get into some more numbers-based stuff, but please, if you've got questions, send them to Eric, put them in the chat bar, email Eric at harbortrucker.com, because we want to make this interactive. I mean, Justin is a featured guest on national TV talking about polling, talking about elections. We're very fortunate to have him. So please make sure that you're sending those questions in. And Eric, start queuing some of them up, because I've got one for Justin, and then I want to hear what some of our listeners have to ask. But it's kind of a two-part question, because you mentioned New York, and one of the interesting things I think is that New York reported last month that over 400,000 residents of the city have left since the beginning of COVID, and a lot of that is they've either lost their job or their company said you don't need to be here anymore because we're not going to require you to come back into an office. What has that done? Obviously, we've seen that not just in New York, but other expensive urban areas where people have said, you know what, I'm going to leave because $60,000 a year in New York is nothing. But if I move, if I move to Philadelphia, or if I move just an hour away, or if I move up into New England, I could buy a house with that as opposed to have 4 roommates in a 1-bedroom apartment. We see that in California, high taxes. We see more and more people moving to states like Nevada, Arizona, Texas. So obviously, with that comes interesting trends, and it may not be for this election, but for future elections. We've seen it, for instance, in Austin, Texas, whereas Austin's grown, it's become a more progressive city. It's different than the rest of Texas. So how do some of those things maybe change elections? Not maybe today, but moving forward, because I think we're all going to be looking at what happens in 2 years with the mid-years, no matter who wins. And then secondarily, it seems to me like this is 100% a Trump election, right? You either are very passionately for him or very passionately against him. I don't know too many people. It wouldn't have mattered who got the Democratic nomination. There were people that were going to get behind that person no matter what. But you still have a lot of folks that haven't bought in on Joe Biden, right? The Bernie folks, for instance, they're not burning for Joe.
Right.
You've got some of the folks that were looking for someone younger, like a Buttigieg, or a Harris, or a number of the 25 people that were on stage. They had to have 2 nights worth of debates. So how do you see voters shifting, impacting elections either this year or future? And then secondarily, do you think that because this election is all around Trump, it's his to win or lose between now and November?
Yeah. So the first question. Remember the first one, because in fact, let me go backwards. Let me start with the Trump one. First and foremost, Biden definitely has an enthusiasm gap. So, as a party, there's all sorts of lost opportunity there in view of party card-carrying Democrats. One is, the presidential nominee himself. And we had the most diverse set of candidates vying for that job. Whether it's Buttigieg or Latinas and blacks, and how diverse can you get? What did we got? We got an old white guy. That's depressing. You want to talk about something that causes an organization to look inward? That should be something that causes an organization to look inward.
I've called this election dinner during COVID. One party has given us a burnt dinner, and the other one's given us leftovers. And for many of us foodies, we would really like something a little bit more appetizing on the palate. Not to give away any of my political preferences, but yeah. I think there's a large segment of America who was hoping for somebody a little bit more moderate, a little less extreme. That's not what we got.
It's not what we got. And at the same time, on the Democratic side, so Trump is feeding into the anger of people whose hopes and dreams and goals have not been heard by Washington. So there's that core group of folks who said, we keep electing people. This happened in 2016. We keep electing people, and they're not listening to me. And then Trump spoke to them, and they felt listened to. That group still feels listened to by Trump. Bernie spoke to the exact opposite group of people who felt the exact same way, though. Right? They felt differently about all the policy issues, but felt extraordinarily angry. That group still exists, and they don't have a champion. They just don't. It's certainly not Kamala. It's certainly not Joe Biden. And as Joe Biden starts to speak to them, he gets in that same challenge that Trump gets in with the people who are kind of on the fringe there. How motivated are people who hold their nose and vote? And that's when we start doing these polls. It's not just, am I going to vote for? And then we see this very small, very, very small unsure group. That unsure group isn't actually the set of people. It's the people who say that I'm probably going to vote. Those are the people that we're looking at. And that's the battleground in that space. So yeah, the unsure people, everyone focuses on that. You have to focus on that. But the folks who are saying I'm definitely going to vote, it's not as solidified as you'd think it is just looking at the polls, which says one number, I'm going to vote this way. It's actually much more multidimensional than that. So we'll see. I think that enthusiasm is not in Biden's favor right now. That's one of his big problems, and Kamala did nothing to help with that. So, and then the first question, remind me.
So yeah, and Eric, I'm going to invite you to come back on and give us any questions we have. But it was about as we've seen a shift in population because of COVID, as people have left some of the dense urban areas to go elsewhere because it's cheaper to live. They lost their job. They don't have to go into an office. How should we expect some things to change moving forward? For instance, like I said, Texas is a red state, but it's become more blue as companies have relocated there, as Austin has continued to grow. So maybe not for this election, but for future elections, for the midterm that's going to come up in 2 years. What are some key battleground states that may shift? What are some states that are tried and true, red or blue, that are going to turn into toss-up states? Like, what are some things that we should look at as voters, as concerned citizens, to say, things are changing in front of our eyes, and COVID may have pushed things into those directions a little bit faster?
Sure. Yeah, the core issue of affordability, of course, is massive. And I mean, some of those big moves, big groups of people are being moved by affordability from a corporate perspective. You get large groups of tech shifting into Texas, things like that. And that tends to drive a lot of that blue tint into places like Texas. And but it is also followed by lots of individual choice. And one of the things that we do really throughout the country is we hold a lot of focus groups. They tend to be economically oriented a lot. And in those high cost areas, we're finding that people who work, even, across the board, entrepreneurs, people with full-time jobs, the wife has a full-time job, the husband has a full-time job, people who are significant contributors to their community, they don't view home ownership in that community as a likelihood. They've given up on it. And there is a lack of passion about that. They have chosen that they will not have that fulfillment in their lifetime in that state. So when they do retire, if they do retire, which by the way is a totally separate question, there's an increasing group of people who feel they never will, they're going to retire in a home in another state. And those folks, as they move out, they're being driven economically, and they're typically economic drives or they're driven by democratic progressive principles, and they view that as such. But the anger there is very much driven towards all of whoever the seat of government is. They view Sacramento as the problem, Washington as the problem, and it really is up to any candidate or movement to speak the language to those people, which so far is being spoken a little bit by President Trump, but I think nowhere near as effectively as it could be to those people who are having to move their lives and change their lives based on the dynamics of their local economy or the local government, their state government or the state economy, or the overall national government. So things that'll flip and change, I think, as we start to see registration numbers shift a little bit, like in Texas, we start to see a little bit of movement around those kinds of places. Let's not forget that there are other states that are equally capable of shifting in the other direction. And we always look at Maine is one of those places that could, we've got a Republican senator from there, yes, but it's by no means a red part of the world, and it could become more red, strangely enough. And the focus is always on it's going to go blue, we're going to lose Susan Collins. This is kind of the Republican NRCC perspective, but it could just as easily become more red as there's more displacement. People aren't just going to Texas, they're going to other parts of the world too. So.
That's great. Eric, do we have some questions?
Yeah, we have quite a few. So, we still have room in the queue, so go ahead and keep sending them. The first one up is the 528 polls are trending all towards Biden. Why do you think voters will not admit they are Trump supporters? And can you revisit how big the shy Trump voter block is?
Sure. I don't think it's larger than 1 or 2%. I think it's much smaller than people think it is. But 1 or 2% is a massive amount in an election. I mean, that's what won the last election, essentially. It's not a big amount, but it's just enough. And if you are talking about polls and they're within the margin of error or close to it, that's something to keep in mind. And what we often see is that, and 528 is an aggregator of polls, and they're doing their own kind of, they have their backroom math and they create a probability based on that. You can also look at RCP's trending averages, and right now, Biden's 6 or 7 points up. I didn't check today, so maybe it's a little bit higher, maybe it's a little bit lower, but typically he's been 6 or 7 points up over the last couple of weeks. The margin of error on those polls is somewhere between 3 and 4%. So outside of the margin of error, gravity's going towards Biden. But if you say, well, 1 or 2% of Republicans and independents aren't really voicing their views one way or another, suddenly that margin shrinks. And we did see that in the last election. So it sounds like a little bit of sorcery and magic, but it's not. It's just respecting how people respond, and understanding that in some cases there is that very small proportion who are not willing to say, and increasingly less willing to say, by the way, that they're going to vote for a president that they find personally distasteful.
Gotcha. Do you think that that shy voter bloc are geographically evenly distributed everywhere, or are they particularly located in one region or another?
On average, evenly distributed, because it has to do with a number of different demographic factors. It has to do with, you can slice it as a zillion ways, but it even has to do with religious background. I mean, there's evangelicals who feel that way. There's it's just in a particular area, one demographic may be more pronounced than another, but because it's such a small percentage, it's really evenly distributed.
Gotcha. Thank you. The next question on the block is, I'll just read it word for word. I'm hearing and seeing that AOC, so Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, is getting more and more influential. Is that true? And don't both sides of the aisle kind of have a fear of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Nancy Pelosi, who is one of the sharpest tools in the shed, she's very, very bright, very effective. You will see her very capably manage people like Cortez, who is more or less allowed to be on network, allowed to have a very vocal voice, is given some, a couple little crumbs here and there. But I mean, what real influence do you see outside of the media that she has? So I think you see her and both sides kind of cringe a little bit, except the hyper progressive side, because Democratic groups tend to look at it and say, geez, there's just too much radical here. We're going to scare people. Republicans look at it and say, oh my God, this is really the core drivers of Democrats. You know how either edge views this sort of thing. But at core, the traditional Democratic Party, those who are actually in power, have done a very, very good job of blocking and tackling, in large part, personalities like that.
Do you think, as a follow-up that came from me, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think other members of either the Senate or the House that this kind of influential personality type of people that aren't maybe Speaker of the House or Senate leaders or the President are going to be popping up more and more? And will they eventually have a actual on-the-ground influence towards voters outside of their own jurisdiction, or maybe more policy-wise?
If I could re-ask that, so Justin, who do you see as rising stars in both political parties that could have that broader impact? And do you think historically one of the big knocks was that once you got elected, you never got unelected, right? And then that changed, I think, with the internet and social media. People, the old saying was you just had to get through Wednesday's headline and then you didn't have to worry about it. Now people tweet things that happened 50 years ago and people are held accountable for it. So who are the rising stars? And do you think that we'll continue to see this disruption where we see some doors that continuously are revolving as to who has those seats?
Yeah, two things on that. One, on the rising stars thing, it's not a particular strength of mine to have those personalities kind of tracked along. Should, that'd be good, but I don't. On the other hand, what I can say quite confidently is the Democratic Party is going through the same convulsions the Republican Party went through 10, 15 years ago. So there is a section that is extremely progressive, and whether they either view themselves as safe or they're so ideologically strident that they don't care, and that they will drive themselves ideologically, period. And that's going to impact the ability to legislate. It impacted the Republicans' ability to be effective on a regular and ongoing basis. It absolutely torpedoed the efforts back and forth with the Affordable Care Act. And there was an extraordinary lack of situational awareness on those Republican legislators' parts, who were largely driven selfishly by their own district, because they knew they were safe and they knew they could be as obstinate as they felt and get those sound bites and be okay all day long and twice on Sunday. And they were ineffective. Actually, they were counterproductive on the Hill, but it didn't matter to them because they got reelected over and over and over again. And in this case, the Democratic Party is going through much of the same thing, because progressives are getting elected out of hubris, largely out of hubris from those who are incumbents, who you'll have an incumbent who's incumbent for several cycles or 20 years, and they feel that they're untouchable. And they feel that everyone knows me and I don't need to communicate in a meaningful fashion. And this young upstart is not going to unseat me. It turns out that young upstart can absolutely 100% unseat that person. And because they're an upstart in today's world, they can raise unfathomable amount of money. They don't need to raise money from within their district. They raise massive amounts of dough. Take Maryland's Congressional District 7. So I mean, you've got Kimberly Klacik, who is a Republican running in a district that is 70 or 80% Democratic. the amount of money that's pouring in for Kim Klacik is unheard of, and that allows her to punch above her weight. Whether she'll win or not is anyone's guess, but it's that sort of thing that creates this dynamic of young guns who are willing to say pretty much whatever they feel extraordinarily entitled, and the longer they keep the seat, the more they'll feel that way. But yeah, I'm sorry I don't have good insight on the folks to follow. I just don't. Until someone hires me, I take less consideration about the actual individual players.
And no problem.
Worries. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to make sure that we're on track on time. We'll continue to have some Q&A, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity, Justin, for you to talk a little bit about the numbers, decode what's going on, as you said. So maybe we shift gears just a little bit, take about 4 or 5 minutes to do some of that, and then go back to Q&A to close it out.
Perfect. So when you're looking at polls, and there's a zillion polls out there, there's just a couple of things to keep in mind. First and foremost, you should be able to read the methodology. So you read a poll, it's in the newspaper, this poll says X, Y, and Z, you usually get the results. What's important to, in fact, more important than results, is to understand how that poll was conducted and who it was conducted with. So there's two critical things: methodology, that's how these interviews took place, and who was asked. If it's a political poll, the first and foremost thing in terms of who was asked was, are they voters? And a lot of these polls that you'll see, you'll go into the methodology and you can actually go read the script, and they'll say, are you 18 years or older? Are you registered to vote? Those are garbage polls, absolute garbage. Throw them in the trash, walk away, burn them, make fun of them, do whatever makes you feel good, but do not take them as seriously, because you know as a pollster if that person's registered. And in most states, you know where they live, you know their gender, you know what their political party. Some states you don't. You know, Hawaii hasn't tracked a political party since 1980. But we do know some likelihood and lean, because we know how people kind of raise their hand in which primaries they vote in over time. You know much more as a pollster than people tend to think you know. We know an extraordinary amount of information. So the first thing that should be out of the pollster's mind in that script is, may I speak to Weston Lamar? I'm calling you, Weston, because I want to talk to you. You fit a demographic stratification that matches the voter turnout model that I've modeled. You know, if I'm incapable of modeling a turnout model, which does happen, by the way, I mean, sometimes there's not enough information, then you're the overall voter stratification that mirrors the demographic voting population of that state, county, city, whatever it might be. It's the first thing to look at. Is it voters, or are they having to ask, am I 18 or over, am I a voter? It's the first thing. It should be of a voter file, and you know. The other thing is, there are all sorts of different kinds of methodologies. Rather than drawing a hard line and saying something's junk and something isn't junk, sometimes there are things that don't work for certain situations that work pretty darn well in other situations. Increasingly, though, landline only robopolls are not delivering accurate information. They are what are called IVR polls. If you look at it and say what kind of, what the mixture of mobiles to landlines, they're 100% landline. The problem with that is it's excluding a massive amount of the population. If you look at CDC reports, it's like something like 78% of America is mobile phone only. And those that are mobile phone mostly, that number skyrockets. So you've taken 78% of America and you've thrown them out of the room. How can you expect to get an accurate perspective? That said, you can still get some decent directional information if you're looking at the delta between two numbers, if you're not actually looking at the value of the number itself, but that takes a degree of more sophistication. Also, when you're digging into these things, make sure that depending on where it's done, that language is included, right? Who in their right mind in California is not going to survey in Spanish as well as English? You have to. It's an absolute have to be done. So it's important to take a look at that. Certain districts, you have to survey in Tagalog, you have to survey in the languages that people are willing to respond to. It doesn't mean discount those surveys that have multi-modes. In many cases, you're going to have a survey that will have a live telephone interviewers and, for example, text online technology. And in many cases, if it's done right, that can yield extremely accurate results. So the trick is, one, make sure that they're telling you how the poll is done. Huh?
I always text back stop, no matter who's texting me. I'm polling, so I'm frustrated.
Yeah, I hate it too. But with certain demographics, so if you kind of try and get into a certain demographic, if you're underweighted, for example, in a very small universe, so you're trying to build out your younger voters, you can actually employ text online, and it works pretty doggone well. But you're absolutely right. I don't respond to them either, which is why you have to include in a really robust poll, you have to include live telephone interviewers, and those people have to be nice. You know, you can't have a robo click at the end of it that says you have that space between the call and when someone talks. That has to be a manual call. That has to go straight to you. They have to ask you by name. They have to be nice, and they should ask you an open-ended question to start to disarm you. But those are kind of the rules of thumb. For a small regional poll, like a citywide poll, you should have 300 respondents. That'll give you good statistic validity. For a statewide poll, anywhere between 750 and 1,000. For a national poll, 1,000, maybe 2,000. Keep in mind, when you start looking at online polls, one of the things that's funny is you look at a poll that's an online product. By the way, not all online polls are bad. A lot of them are very, very good. But be careful how you read them. And if you see an online poll with a massive, massive sample, and it's outside of an academic institution, which has other goals that they're trying to do, so they need a huge sample. They almost have to fill out certain almost census-like activities. What they're trying to do is they're trying to achieve a margin of error by virtue of expanding the sample. But the problem is math doesn't work like that. If you have a faulty foundation and you're not stratified correctly, you're not contacting the right people so that you have an accurate reflection of your voting population. If you just expand the sample size, you're making that problem worse, right? If you say 2 + 2 is 5 instead of 4, and then you start multiplying that by 6, any times over, that your gap becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So little things like that to look at. First and foremost is someone using the voter file.
That's great. Eric, let's do one more question before we wrap it up. Pick a good one.
Oh, okay. Well, the next one in the line is pretty good. For Biden to pick Harris, do you think that has hindered his campaign and how people that are on the independent side of things will view him, if Harris would draw more independent voters or not?
Good question. I think the challenge is that it doesn't generate the kind of enthusiasm amongst the Black voter bloc, which does tend to vote more as a bloc than other demographic groups. So, as drawing a sharp distinction between the Black voter bloc versus the Latino voter bloc, for example, which is much more varied and much more nuanced in its behavior. The challenge is that Kamala Harris is not viewed necessarily across the board as, quote, one of us. And on top of that, she has very specific policy prescriptions that are closely aligned with, for example, the crime bill. It may not actually be a direct alignment, but what she's done is seen as being hard on crime. And that is not something that the community, especially in urban environments, views kindly. That will at best create a suppression of enthusiasm. And those Black voters who are not enthused, who do not feel that she adequately represents the Black community as a whole, will not go and cast their ballots. And that's one of the biggest challenges with Biden. That's one of the reasons why Biden has an enthusiasm gap, is I don't think she was well chosen.
Well, so Justin.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
We're running up against the top of the hour,
yeah.
but Justin, we do have some more questions. Is it okay if we maybe share that with you offline? It'd be great to get some of your responses. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to, if you have time, I know you'll be busy, but I'd like to invite you back post-election to kind of do a post-mortem on what happened. How did the election turn out the way it did? Do a little bit of a deeper dive on the Senate side, since we'll know at that point in time how that's going, and then maybe just talk a little bit about what we should expect between January 1, 2021 and the midterms in 2022. But very much appreciate having you, and I'll welcome you to make any closing remarks.
No, absolutely. I'd love to. Please look forward to it. Just send off a flare and I'll be there. The only thing I would say is that polls change very, very quickly and sentiment changes very, very quickly. So as we see little spikes that tend to happen, by the way, with the exception of Supreme Court justice nominations, that will continue. That energy will continue. But other spikes, they come and go. So don't, if something happens and it seems like a very big deal that week, don't be surprised if it's just completely off the radar the next.
Gotcha. Well,
thank you so much. We will have this hosted on our YouTube channel, so folks will be able to see this. Again, just thank you so much for joining us. It's good to get the insider knowledge. It's hard to travel to DC right now, so you can't sit at Feather and just listen to people chatter as they come in and out. But you know, we appreciate you letting us know from the Beltway what to expect November 3rd. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Wesley. Good to see you.
all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, audience members. If you have any follow-up questions, shoot them my way. We're also having an event with Senator Capito tomorrow, if you're interested in joining us. And then be on the lookout for our next digital happy hour. If you're operate out of Long Beach, we're going to be trying to host some of the people running for city council. So yeah, just be on the lookout for that. You could always reach me, Eric@harbortrucker.com, and enjoy the rest of your day.